So if I was going to pick up Soul Broken, who's your audience? Who's looking for this book?
So I would say anybody who has gone through the experience of grieving a loved one they've lost, but not to a physical death. So
Yeah,
when a relationship changes, an important relationship changes. This isn't when your barista, transfers stores or your postal carrier switches routes, but where there's been an intimacy in relationship, whether it's from your family of origin with a parent or a sibling, a grandparent, maybe it's a best friend or partner spouse, an otherwise intimate relationship, when that person, for a myriad of reasons, is no longer as they once were, and the relationship is no longer as it once was. We don't have the societal norms that we do with a physical death. And how
yeah,
do we grieve that? How do we know how to support one another going through this? So, whether you've had that experience of grieving somebody who is still alive, or somebody you care about is going through that experience.
Insight and Awareness Spiritual Explorer. Soul intuitive, emotional and spiritual mentor and award-winning author Lorraine Nylon.
welcome explorers. Thank you for being part of the adventure. And today our guest is Stephanie Sarazin. She's a writer, a grief educator, and the author of Soul Broken, Guidebook for your journey through ambiguous grief. Thank you for being a guest. I'm very excited to talk to you. And could you tell us what led you to write this book?
Oh, well, hello, Lorraine, and thanks so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be in conversation with you. What led me to write the book is that it was the book I needed but couldn't find. And I searched uh, high and low. I asked for recommendations, referrals, and there are always so many terrific choices that were recommended, but not in a cohesive one part experience, And so I I felt compelled to, as I moved further into my healing and was working earnestly toward that, to just to be very aware of what was and wasn't working for me, which is so subjective. It was just my experience, But I took a lot of notes. I wrote and journaled and really kept a record. And so years later, it it all came together and is the book Soul Broken.
So if I was going to pick up Soul Broken, who's your audience? Who's looking for this book?
So I would say anybody who has gone through the experience of grieving a loved one they've lost, but not to a physical death. So
Yeah.
when a relationship changes, an important relationship changes. This isn't when your barista, transfers stores or your postal carrier switches routes, but where there's been an intimacy in relationship, whether it's from your family of origin with a parent or a sibling, a grandparent, maybe it's a best friend or partner spouse, an otherwise intimate relationship, when that person, for a myriad of reasons, is no longer as they once were, and the relationship is no longer as it once was. We don't have the societal norms that we do with a physical death. And how
Yeah.
do we grieve that? How do we know how to support one another going through this? So, whether you've had that experience of grieving somebody who is still alive, or somebody you care about is going through that experience, the book includes my own story as well as a compilation of many others from people I've interviewed over the years, as well as data I've conducted from surveys and actionable steps, things that may or may not work for you. Even things that didn't work for me, I include because maybe that will work for you.
And I think that's the thing that people need to acknowledge is when you are, you know, when you're in a traumatic experience and whatever you class as a traumatic experience, and if you are grieving a loss of anything, and actually I was talking to someone about your book, and she said that she used to work with special ed children, and she said a lot of the parents were grieving the child they thought they were going to have. and they were really struggling. So she thought, it's a really good way of even looking at that as well. But
That's yes, absolutely. And Lorraine, you're the first person to mention that to me in a number of conversations I've had, right, since the book has come out. And what's so divine about you mentioning that is that I am a special needs sibling. So
all right.
growing up, I was experiencing ambiguous grief. I was I was experiencing it in my household, not knowing what it was. My brother Eric was born with severe special needs and never walked, never spoke a word, and yet he has been my life's greatest teacher. And
Mhm.
as I was writing the book in 2021, and through its edits in 2022 before it was published, it occurred to me, oh my goodness, I've had ambiguous grief has been a part of my life far longer than I understood it to be. And so in Eric died in June, just a few weeks
Oh.
ago, and I'm so grateful that I had that realization um, while I could still talk with him about it.
Yeah, that's brilliant, and I'm sorry for your loss too. And it is one of those things. I think the reality is that we've all lived with this type of grief and not realised it. I make jokes about I thought everyone went home to the Waltons or the Brady Bunch kind
Mm.
of families, and then you sort of ours was slightly dysfunctional, and I used to but you are comparing and grieving that you think that's the life you should be having, and you've got this whole it's not real, but it's the so you can sometimes have that grief based on an illusion as well.
Oh, absolutely. That's so insightful. And so many of us do because we're living in a reality that isn't living up to what we think it should be. When again, it's just a false judgment. To begin with, we're not we're not working with apples to apples here.
Yeah, and that's what you get in a lot of, especially people that are in narcissistic relationships and things like that as well, is you're
Yes.
trying to create the relationship that you think's healthy, and you've got a partner that's not meeting you halfway or anywhere on the plate actually. So you start grieving what you think, and then people turn it on themselves and start
So
blaming
often.
themselves. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And I think until we can better understand what we're experiencing isn't a failure or isn't, mild disappointment. It's grief. And
Yeah.
until we're able to really kind of put our arms around that and honor it and experience grief,
Yeah.
we're carrying extra weight with us that we don't need to. And it's not
Yeah.
easy, of course. If somebody had kind of said to me early on, "Oh, it's going to be okay." It's gonna be fine. It's nothing I would have wanted to hear, because of course, if you've lost somebody you love to a physical death or, what I call an activating event,
Yeah.
uh,
I
right?
like that. Yeah, an activating event. Yes, I
Yes.
really like that.
And there are so many, right? And
Yeah,
so when you experience that, whether it is, in my personal situation, it was the discovery that my marriage wasn't what I thought it was. The
yeah,
illusion you're talking about, right? And and then a subsequent divorce. But what I learned as I was trying to find people who could talk to me about their experience. Oh, Lorraine, I was so surprised to find that nobody knew anybody who could speak to me about a similar experience. I was looking for somebody. I certainly knew I wasn't the first person to go through this experience, and was looking for somebody to kind of say, "Oh, listen, this I went through this 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Here are my notes. Here's what you do. Here is what might help you feel a little bit better because without societal norms to, you know, engage us and help us know what to do, as we would with a physical death,
yeah,
people kind of scatter. And so for me again it was divorce, discovery and divorce, but familial estrangement, substance abuse disorder, addiction, indoctrination to a cult or gang, Alzheimer's, dementia, cognitive decline, um, mental health, incarceration. There's just a number of things, job loss and empty nesting,
Mm,
aren't traumatic per se, for most people, but they change the relationship and can activate ambiguous grief, where all of a sudden, and right now, lots of uh, students are leaving the nest and going off to college or going off to life outside of their childhood home, and I'm hearing from a lot of parents, and I'm delighted to be hearing from men too, who are saying, I didn't expect this. Wow, I
yeah,
didn't expect this. I Is this normal? And so it's great that we're talking about it more, and hopefully the more we're talking about it, we'll be able to identify that what we're experiencing is grief. It's ambiguous grief,
yeah.
but it's grief.
And I think there's a couple of different types to it because you have the shock one that like your activating events that put you into a state of shock because what you thought couldn't happen just did. Something you expected never to experience, you're now experiencing. That could be anything from a natural disaster to discovering your husband's having an affair,
Hmm.
or any kind, or your source of income drying up. And then you have the creepers where you have these little events all along, and you're losing a little bit of yourself to it all the way along, and then you kind of need that brick wall, the activating event. And then
Hmm.
then what you do is you grieve all the times you didn't self-support. And that's what I see happens in this kind of traumatic experience is if someone dies, you've got people around you that are saying, I understand that you're hurting. I'm here to support you, whether it's with a casserole standing beside you through the whole journey. When it's this kind of grief, it's like it either triggers other people and they go off into their reactions to it.
Hmm.
So you're there witnessing somebody else telling you their story,
Hmm.
and it's or you have all that kind of thing, or everyone starts to withdraw. So you do have that, and annihilation, not annihilation, where you feel really isolated.
Isolated. You're absolutely right. You speak like you might know this experience or you've
Oh,
seen
I
it
know
up
this
close.
experience.
Yes.
I'm nearly a professional at this
Yeah,
experience.
okay. I'm thinking,
Mm,
this is good. Yes. And to your point of isolation, depending on what the activating event is, or when one realizes whether the
yeah.
shock wears off a little, or what have you, if there is shame and embarrassment
Mm,
associated with this loss, if we internalize it as shame and embarrassment, so often the griever will isolate and tell little to nobody. For me personally, I learned this in my own experience. Had there been a physical death, I would have called friends and family immediately. But
mm,
in a discovery, and then moving forward to start understanding divorce and how to move forward with that, I told one trusted friend and my therapist, who I found the day after discovery.
right.
I told only those 2 people for 3 months. For 3 months, and it wasn't so much that I felt shameful or embarrassed of my decision to move forward, and to divorce. I didn't want to talk about it because I didn't want to be talked about.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
Because I just, this is the kind of thing that we see on, made for TV movies, and it's salacious and it makes a good story. But when it's happening to you and your reality has been inverted, and it
yeah.
is like going through a fun house, and everything is distorted, like a not so fun house, right?
Yeah, I get it though.
Everything is distorted, and the ground is moving from underneath you. It's no longer stable. You don't trust the world around you. You don't
Yeah,
trust yourself. You certainly don't trust this story, such a personal story, whether it's, that you're divorcing due to discovery, or a child is struggling with substance abuse and has run away from home and you don't know where they are, right? Like
yeah.
that's a very real experience that people are having. I actually I interviewed a brilliant, wonderful woman a few years ago who was grieving her husband who had been incarcerated, and she hadn't told anyone. He was 3 years into a 5-year sentence, and she was hoping, thanks to COVID, she was grateful COVID provided some cover,
Right.
right?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
she was ashamed and embarrassed to and protective of her loved one. She didn't
Yeah.
want others to know, so they would be fodder for community gossip. So, again, if we internalize this loss in any form of way as shameful or embarrassing to us, isolation is exactly where the griever ends up. And that's a very lonely, hard place to be when you're grieving.
Well, it is because the problem is you start ruminating. So instead of moving forward, you're stuck in that thought process. And that's why I say, people turn it on themselves because they start identifying everything that they feel that they've either contributed to. And a lot of time, like when I'm working with my clientele, it's sometimes I'll pull it apart and say, that's because you got a caring heart. Like you forgave that, you ignored that, not because you're stupid, but because you were trying to give the benefit of the doubt. You were trying to give grace. You were trying to do all these
Mhm.
things to protect the relationship that you valued. And that can happen with friends and things like that. Somebody says, "Oh, they're talking about you behind your back," and you go, "No, you've taken it out of context." So I would say, like, reality should be in our face and our belief systems back here. But the problem
Oh,
is we put our belief systems up close, the reality's behind it, and then we fill in the gap with the story we want to tell ourselves.
that's
So
exactly
if
right.
yeah,
And
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 then
that
that's what shocks us is when that all falls apart, we go, "But I thought I knew."
right, right. And that if that narrative may not serve us, right? No matter
No.
what that narrative may be, if it is giving grace and acting in love and doing what you think you should be doing, even if
Yeah,
you're acting in the best interest of the relationship. You're right. You're so right. The belief and the reality are kind of in the wrong order.
yeah, yeah, and I try to sometimes you gotta convince people, be self-supporting, and it's not being selfish, but be
That's right.
self-supporting. If you're sacrificing something of yourself, ask yourself why.
Yes.
Mhm.
And when you say that, this is a place where people can get stuck, I paint the picture of quicksand. And if we ruminate and we're in this space of rumination for too long, then it actually becomes a diagnosable condition. It can become a
Yeah,
diagnosable condition, which is complicated grief disorder, or prolonged grief disorder. And in that sense, you are in quicksand, and your grief is now kind of molding and defining your day and defining your life, and your script is going and going and going. And what if I did this, or what if I did that? And what I discovered in my data dive was that for people who are grieving someone who's still living, there was one commonality that I suspected, and then the data showed, is that hope continues to emerge. And when hope keeps popping up, which if you think about it, we're not when our loved one dies a physical death, and we have the funeral and we do the rituals, and we understand that they're not going to come and call us tomorrow or ring the doorbell and apologize or ask
yeah,
for a reconciliation or explain themselves. We understand that they are no longer as they were once. And but when a loved one has not had a physical death, the ambiguous grievers are hoping, and hope is a wonderful, beautiful thing. I understand we need that for our human experience in so many ways.
yeah, definitely.
And yet, for people in ambiguous grief, if you are focused too much on hoping for the other person, hoping that, well, maybe I could find the right, maybe my parent needs the right doctor and a different diagnosis, or maybe my child needs a different treatment center, or if I could just do this, or if I could do that, what could I do to change it? It's busy work to try to bring our loved one back to restore the relationship as it was, but that is what gets us stuck in the quicksand. And
Yeah,
when
for
we're
sure.
in that quicksand, we can't, just like quicksand, we can't extract ourselves. When you're experiencing prolonged grief disorder, you need the help of a professional, of a clinician, to help move you through and out of that quicksand. And one way for grief to start to be acknowledged, of course, first of all, is to know what it is, so you can name it.
Yeah.
And secondly, it's to have it witnessed, and
Yeah.
when we can witness grief, just one person, if one
Yeah.
person can stand in observation, and bear witness to the love that was and has now changed, it can be such a freeing, beautiful opportunity, event, experience, for the griever who didn't get to deliver a eulogy or receive, comments and condolences. And once we have that, Lorraine, I find that it's it's a little easier to shift hope internally, to take it off the external and bring it back to ourselves.
I think that's a really important point, is that hope's good as long as it's focused for you. If it's focused on an external, because I've worked a lot with abuse victims, childhood abuse, sexual abuse victims, and a lot of them have, that's where, that they really educated me on this desire, especially if it's a, family member, that there will be a sorry and a heartfelt I'm sorry, remorse for what occurred, which rarely happens, rarely happens.
Mm.
And it's like, shift that hope back to you, that you start hoping that you feel good about who you are, because you can manage that. You can start putting in place different events and steps and thought processes that can feed that, but waiting for someone else. But we do that. We seem to naturally orientate to wanting that sense of, we're looking for completion. I always say, sometimes when we've, think of it like a circle, and if the circle's not completely closed, if you don't give yourself a way of understanding that, it leaves a gap. And what you'll do is you'll fill that gap with something that may not serve you. So,
Exactly right. That's right.
yeah,
And it's also, it's difficult, isn't it? Because
yeah,
for many people, that gap that's left is sometimes grief, and grief is all we have left of our loved
yeah,
one. The feeling of grief, that sadness or the overwhelm or whatever the experience of longing might be for an individual, might be all that we have left to tether us to that
yeah.
relationship that no longer is. And so we hold on despite the rug burns, the rope burns that are happening. And, it's like we're holding on
Yeah,
and we're
yeah, we're
getting
clingers.
dragged. Yes, we're clingers to,
Clingers, yeah,
right, to what? Because that has changed. And so just being able to shift is such big work, to just shift a little bit out of that trajectory so
yeah,
that we can create a new path and co-create,
yeah,
with our higher power, with our universe, with our loved ones, the life we want.
yeah. Well, and it's funny what we cling to, because if you break it down, a lot of time it's our expectation of what should be. So, what we should have, how that should have worked, and then we get stuck on
Oh.
the why. Why did it? And I can remember, I had a
Mm.
very close friends, we were like sisters, and there was a falling out that sort of drifted in, and I can remember being with another friend, and, I was ruminating. I was
Mhm.
ruminating like there was no tomorrow, and she said to me, "Yeah, it's just unfathomable what's occurred." And I was like, "Oh my god, that's what it is. I can't fathom this. I can't get my head around it." And as soon as she said that, it was like I could put an understanding to what I was experiencing, which was
Yes.
grief. I didn't know it was grief at the time, but it was like, yeah, and it was someone saying, "Oh, this is what I can see." And I went, "Yeah, this is unfathomable." And then
Yes.
then I could come to peace with it a little bit.
Right. And I think something that we're so inclined to do is to search for that happy ending or the silver
Mm,
lining, or we're looking for, if we're ruminating, we might be saying, well, what if I had done this, or if I had
yes.
done that, or, and of course we know that doesn't serve us,
No.
but it keeps us spiraling. But instead, we might be thinking, if we could shift and say, well, okay, so this is the word I have for it now, and to have it validated must have felt so
Oh,
good
relieving.
for you. Yes,
Yes,
yes.
relieving.
And again, that goes to my point of just one person who can witness
Mm,
what you're experiencing, witness your grief, and validate that for you is
yeah.
is liberating. It's relief. And so if we're isolating and not talking about what it is we're grieving, whether it's the friend we've lost, the relationship with a parent or a child or a neighbor or a spouse, whatever it is, if we're not talking about it to anybody, if we're not processing it, it's going to weigh us down. And whether, I love your circle analogy, whether we
Mm.
admit it or not, our circle will never be closed.
Yeah. And we have to, if you can, if you can put it in perspective for yourself, which is part of the process. Everyone's going to go through that ruminating stage. It's just what we do. But it's then, and you can use that as gathering information about when you sort of poke your head out a little bit of it, you can go, oh, this had me and this had me. They're jump points to go and explore why was I clinging to that expectation?
Yes.
Why did I think it was working this way? Why did I ignore all those red flags? And
Yes.
and in, and not beat yourself up, but actually go in there and explore. And all of a sudden, you've got a self-discovery, self-development path unfolding in front of you.
You're exactly right. And I didn't know this before my own experience, but I am a firm believer that grief is a portal to our greatest and highest selves if we allow it.
Yeah,
And
I
and
agree.
and we may not have the language to allow it. We may not know how to allow it. It might be too painful to allow it, as you talk about getting in there and kind of unpacking it and
Mm.
asking those questions about your own behavior and your own choices. It's it's
And the catch is
painful.
then not to turn straight and beat yourself up. You know,
We have to be gentle. We have to give ourselves grace. We're doing the best we can. We're learning,
yeah.
and that's, you're right. So if you do beat yourself up, if you do lament and kick rocks and you think, how could I have? You
No, it's
didn't
part of the
know.
process. Yeah,
Part of the process, and being
process.
able to acknowledge it is the
Yeah.
win. That's the
And
win.
I think when you are coming out of experiences like these, because the sad part is a lot of people never do. They get
Right.
stuck, and Dr. Debbie Silver talks about that. Stage 3 people they feel better. They're starting to relieve some of the pressure, but they're still in that telling the story and living the story.
And it will be
Yeah.
the same story for 20 years. I heard that
Yeah.
episode, yes.
Yes.
And that story is fixed and it doesn't change, and whether it happened 10 or 20 years ago, it's the same, it's told the same way. And that is, it's so sad, truly, because that's somebody who is in the quicksand.
Oh, absolutely. That's a horrible way to be, for you, because you're hurting yourself constantly. And that's the problem, is that we don't recognize it, but you're actually sitting there hurting yourself, hurting yourself, hurting yourself. And then we get addicted to the hurt.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. Absolutely. And we inflict more trauma on
Mm.
ourselves through this way. It's like a band aid. If we can, once we're able to identify, oh, maybe I should look at what I've experienced here. Maybe I should look at my choices, and really, if you're aware that you might be starting down the path of doing this work, hold the course, right? Hold
Yeah.
that line, stay there is my best advice to people. If you, once you have that in your awareness, oh, hold on to it, because it will be hard and painful, most likely, but in the long run, it is just ripping off the band-aid,
Yeah,
as
for sure.
compared to the
Yeah.
the
The
other option.
constant, yeah. And I always say to clients, because sometimes, I can see they're ready to run. Like, emotionally, it's too confronting, and I'll say to them, if you're at the point where you think you've got to run because this is emotionally hard, that's the
Hmm.
time you stop and you
Yes.
just stand there. Don't expect anything from yourself. Don't try and fix it. Just
Right.
acknowledge that this is the wild part. and let
Oh,
yourself absorb it a little bit and observe it a lot.
oh, that's brilliant.
Yeah,
Absorb it a little and observe it a lot. I'll
a lot.
remember that. That's brilliant. And something that I find was helpful to me, and I'm hearing such wonderful feedback about, is in terms of being helpful to others, is when you get to that space and you can observe and ask yourself, what is it that you need?
That's
Oh,
a
and
good
just
question.
listen to yourself answer you. What do I need right now? For me, what I needed, Lorraine, was a societal norm that didn't exist. I felt like a widow, but I wasn't
Right?
treated like one. You mentioned the casseroles. I get on my casserole tangent now and again. And I had a marriage that I had loved, 20 years, and yet when this happened, I didn't have the opportunity to go through any of those societal norms I mentioned, and I didn't have the casseroles delivered. And I'm thinking, why? And then I find myself feeling jealous of widows, which is, I mean that with no disrespect. I'm
Yeah, I
just
get it.
vulnerably, honestly, I'm sharing. I thought, oh, look, yes, it's so horrible and awful. I lost my husband too, in a different way,
Yeah,
and nobody is acknowledging this.
yeah.
And I'm so what I needed was a ritual. I needed a funeral. And so I invited two people only.
Mhm.
And I call this, in the book I write about, a faux funeral. And
Right.
if we can bring ritual and create what we need for us. And so I curated the music and the poetry and the readings, and I wrote a eulogy for my marriage. And with the two friends who knew my marriage up close the best, I, had watched it for a number of years. I asked them to come, and they spoke. And then at the end, we I received them. I I received their condolence, and it was such a relief for me to be witnessed in that way, because, again, as you said in the beginning, so many people, when these different activating events happen for
Mhm.
ambiguous grievers, people flee. It
Yeah,
might be difficult because it triggers something within them, or maybe they just don't know what to do with it,
yeah,
or it's we don't have language. We're not where we need to be yet. But I think we're moving in the right direction to better help people, one another, and ourselves through this.
yeah. And what do you think would be the if you've got a friend that is experiencing that, what's the greatest thing you can do for them?
Validate,
Okay. Yeah.
validate. And you were a beautiful example of sharing your friend validating
Mm.
yours by just saying it's unfathomable. And
Yeah.
so, not trying, we're so silver lining, motivated here. We don't want to see our friends in pain and hurting, so we look for solutions. But really, that's not what they're looking for. If a friend, if somebody and love is going through a time of ambiguous grief, saying, "This sounds so hard. This is really hard,"
Yeah.
is so comforting. To say, "What can I do for you?" We don't want to do that. That just puts the onus on the griever to now come up with something to do. But depending on the situation, just tune in to your friend. What might they need? Might they need ice cream delivered? Might they need a friend to sit with? Might they? And you can say, would you like any of these three things? And then you give them three choices.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
you're, but it's not a problem any good-hearted friend, well-meaning friend can solve, as much as we might want to.
Absolutely, because I think the worst thing you can do is try to come in and fix someone because then it becomes about your control and what you wanna do. And the one thing
That's
I
right.
explain to a lot of people is pain of any type is so personal. I can try to explain my pain to you, but you're not gonna fully understand my pain, and I'm not gonna fully understand your pain. So
That's right.
we can have a bit of a theme, but it's so personal. So it's like it's just acknowledge that I see you going through it. I'm here for you. And
Exactly.
yeah.
It is, and it's just as intimate as the relationship you're grieving.
Mm,
Whether it's your best friend again or your spouse, it is nobody knows the intimacy of that relationship other than the people involved in the relationship. And so we can't compare them to
yeah,
our own, and I was recently speaking and talking about how a, a child who is grieving the rehoming of his beloved dog, a 6-year-old child grieving the rehoming of the beloved dog, and a woman, an elderly woman, grieving the physical death of her husband. When for so many of us, when you think about those two individuals grieving, we tend to give more weight to the elderly woman who spent decades with her husband who has now died. But we can't judge. We can't infer based on limited data, much less all the data, unless we were in it, because perhaps that woman had been abused for decades and was feeling
yeah,
more than anything relief
belief.
that he had died. We
Yeah,
don't know. And here, as a 6-year-old child who has had no grief, but has now suddenly lost his best friend, how how can we weigh that?
yeah, you can't compare it.
We can't
It's
compare. We don't
no.
know. To your point, we don't know.
Yeah, yeah, it's fascinating, and it's just just be respectful that that person's feeling pain, even for circumstances that you think shouldn't be major. If it's major to that person, you just respect that. That's it.
Absolutely. And conversely, I'll add, because this is coming up quite a bit recently. Um, if somebody isn't grieving the way you think they should be grieving, right?
Yeah,
That's really not for any of us to decide. And the technical language is mourning, right? Mourning is
yeah,
public grief. So if you see somebody posting, on social media that they are going on with their life and smiling, um, maybe even traveling, it's not cause for alarm,
mm,
because maybe you wouldn't do that after, the loss of your parent to a physical death, but this person can, and that doesn't need an intervention. But again, we are so quick to put our own personal experience and to project that on to what somebody else should be or
yeah,
shouldn't
and
be
even
doing in grief.
our expectation of what
Right.
should be based on what we're not sure. You know what I mean?
Exactly, right. We really need to mind our own kitchen and do our own work, because I think that I would guess, if we all just took a look inside, we'd find something along the way in our lifetime that we have grieved and not yet processed,
For
right?
sure.
So we can do our own work.
Yeah, that's for sure. So I'm going to ask you the question I ask everyone on the podcast. What do you think humanity needs to acknowledge and understand for us to evolve?
Mm. Oh, I think it's just such a beautiful question, first of all. What do we need to acknowledge and understand? I think we need to acknowledge that we are capable of learning so much.
Yeah.
And in our learning, we are able to help one another co create the life we want to live. I think that I think that grief is truly an opportunity to not only, provide that opportunity for personal reflection and personal growth and spiritual evolution, but I think it is an opportunity, as we better understand our grief and are able to more fully and compassionately show up for others in their grief. I
Mm.
think that's how we have a real opportunity to move humanity forward. I think we can move human consciousness forward when we understand, so much of what we've been talking about, right? That we are in pain, and pain is a part of being human, and isn't something to turn from, but turn to. And when we
Yeah.
can turn toward our pain and know we're supported, even by one person,
Yeah.
I think we can really do incredible, powerful things for humanity and really level up our whole experience.
I love that because I think that if I look at it, if the uniqueness of that person and of what they're experiencing is supported, not not completely directed, but, supported to let them go through their personal process of whatever that is then there's a sense of security in being able to explore.
That's
Because
right.
as soon as we go into, "You should think this, you should do that, this is how it's gonna work, you'll be fine, you'll get there," all those things, they don't help anyone. But if you just sometimes it's, just standing beside someone. You don't even have to say anything, and
That's
you
right.
just go, let them do their thing, but they know that you're there,
And you
and that
validate and say, "This is so hard. This seems
yeah.
so hard. This looks so hard," and uh, that validation can just be so affirming.
It can be, and a lot of people are grieving stuff they don't understand. You can have any type of relationship.
Oh,
It could be a work colleague, it could be a best
hmm.
friend, it could be a relation, of any type, and all of a sudden something's changed, and that person has no idea why. So,
Right.
and then they've got no access to talk to them because the other person's not talking or they're not being honest. So they feel a huge difference in the relationship, but they can't put their finger on what it
Yes.
happens. What
And
happened?
what you're describing so beautifully. I don't know if you've seen this film. It was out this past year, The Banshees of Inisherin. It
No,
is it
haven't
is
seen it.
it was a darling of the Oscars, and I believe it's an Irish film. It's certainly set in Ireland, and just you know um top level design and direction and cast. Oh, it's incredible. And it is about two male friends, adult males on a remote island off the coast of Ireland at the turn of the last century, so
Right,
early 1900s. And one friend says to the other, "I just don't want to be your friend anymore." The whole film goes through its ambiguous grief personified here on the big screen, and it's so brilliantly done. They never mention that he's grieving or that it's ambiguous grief, but you see the hope that I mentioned earlier. You see, one character direct all his hope toward, If I could just fix me or understand what I did to fix it, or if you would just tell me." The other
yeah,
person isn't interested, and
yeah.
it is a film to watch, Lorraine. I highly
I
recommend it.
will be watching it, Stephanie, don't you worry.
Yes. Yes.
Because it's interesting because, like, I see a lot of people, then they're really struggling with it because they can't close the gap in the circle because they don't understand what actually happened. And you have the drift. You have friends that you drift away from, but when you see them again, you're friendly. Like, it's just circumstances, but
Mhm.
that's not what I'm talking about. It's this real sort of change. And a lot of the time, it's just the person themselves that has created the change is struggling so much within themselves that they're pushing everybody away. It's not necessarily because of that person.
That's
You're
right.
just in the part of the push out, and that a lot of times those people trying to recreate something or and feel they've shifted blame possibly where the blame doesn't need to be.
Oh, you're so right. Yes. And
Yeah.
and again, if a friend feels embarrassed or you know, doesn't want to talk about it because they don't want to be perceived as talking about the friend that they're trying to rectify
Yeah.
things with, it just becomes this chicken or egg situation, this horrible loop. And and so then maybe they don't speak about it, and they don't know that they're not alone. They don't know other
Yeah.
people are going through this, right? And they're, to your point, they're just the collateral damage in somebody else's story. It's not anything they did or didn't do. It's not
Yeah.
about them, but that's so hard to
Oh,
understand, right?
yeah.
And I think we do such it's so interesting. When I started looking at social media was terrific for this to see we do such a great job at celebrating our beginnings. You name the beginning and it's, social media talk, it's all over the feeds, right? Whether it's a new job or a new business, with the big scissors or
Yeah,
engagements or gender reveals or, our ceremonies, all of the things. And those are wonderful. Yes, yes, yes. We should be celebratory. But what happens when there's infertility and when there's a diagnosis and our child will be nonverbal and we have to
yeah,
come to terms with that? What happens when there's a divorce or bankruptcy of the business, right? This is part of the human experience. It's not all happy, pictures. It isn't. And yet we don't post about our endings. We don't,
true.
we don't, for whatever reason, some cultures say you don't air your dirty laundry, you don't talk about things outside of the family. For a whole host of reasons, people aren't talking about the endings. And I think that once we can, I think there's a lot of room for improvement there, Lorraine, when we can embrace our endings and
Yeah,
say, this was an unfathomable loss to me. I don't understand it. I may never understand it.
yeah,
And I'm honoring myself by moving forward with my life.
yeah,
Create a ritual, have the faux funeral,
yeah,
um, do what you need to do. Again, ask yourself, tune in, be quiet, and ask, listen. What is it you need? Your soul will tell you.
yeah, and it's really interesting because when you do are used to talking to people, about really personal things, you realize how many of us have experienced something very similar. So you're not Robinson Crusoe on an island on your own. It's like this is extremely common. We just don't talk about it.
That's right. But we think we're Robinson Crusoe, don't
Crusoe.
we?
Oh
That's
yeah,
we do. We
it
think,
feels
well,
like it.
I'll have to build my treehouse because I'm going to be here on my island by myself for the rest of my life. But
For sure.
the other side of the island is full.
Yeah, that's
Right.
right. Yeah, wait, and they're all thinking that they're on their own too.
Exactly. Exactly.
Oh, well, I think it's time to flip the book. So would you like to pick a book? We've got
Yes.
1, 2, or 3?
Oh, I just felt pulled to two.
2. Okay, so that's my Your Insight and Awareness book. So it's what we refer to the big book. So you've got 1 to 430 pages to pick.
379. I don't know where that came from.
We love it though when it does that.
Yes.
And you've got, we'll say 1, 2, you've got 4 paragraphs to pick from.
Oh, I don't know why six is coming to my mind. Four paragraphs to choose from.
Yeah,
One.
1. Okay. Um, so it's a dot point. So are we as mankind unconscious to the reality of our own denial?
Would you read that again?
Yeah. So I'll lead you in a little bit better because above it says um, the resolution of unconscious energy. So emotional baggage stuff is what I refer to. So the resolution of unconscious energy is driven by experience. The first dot point is, are we as mankind unconscious to the reality of our denial? And the second dot point is, has mankind chosen to be stagnant in in our unconsciousness?
Wow.
Big.
Wow.
So, and
Interesting.
mankind I refer to, so this was written a long time ago. Mankind I refer to as humanity, I refer to as souls in a human body who realize they're souls in a human body.
Hmm.
Mankind is we're souls in a human body, but we've forgotten that
Hmm.
we're souls in a human body. So,
Hmm.
are we as mankind unconscious to the reality of our own denial?
Yes. And, I think it's so. I just had this conversation last night, which is, again, this is, I see this as divine timing. I've had
Beautiful.
so many experiences that came out of my grief that I no longer say, "Oh, that's weird or crazy or nuts."
Yeah.
It's not. It is divine, right? It
Yeah.
is,
You're
and
in the flow.
I am in the
You're
flow,
aware
and
of the
I
flow.
yes, and I just had this conversation last night, about, are we, do we live in a simulation? Are we aware that we can create our lives, or do we think that, is what is the difference between between a godlike being and nature, no God? And where we kind of ended in this conversation was to say, what's interesting is when one person shares information that resonates, that makes
Yes.
sense, when we feel it,
Yes.
when we can override what our brain is telling us, because our brain is what we've been taught. We're thinking about what we've been taught. But when we hear something and it vibrates, it reverberates, we feel it, and we hold on to it and say, okay, I'm going to pursue that. Let me take a step in that direction. That's not what I've been taught, and that's not what I think. Maybe it's not what I believe, again, with your, you know, but this feels right, and I'm intuitively going to go toward it, right? And when we do that, when one person can shine that light on the path for us, and we go toward it, I think we start to come out of our denial,
Yeah.
right? And this is a tough solution to come to when we think about the way the world works with political economy right now, and who's driving media, right?
Yeah.
And what voices are amplified and what voices are not.
Yeah.
And I think I'm going to be thinking about that for a long time. That's a terrific question.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll
What are
email
your
it.
What are your
Well,
thoughts?
my thing for denial, my understanding of denial, and I'm talking about coming from a position of working with people in their emotional chaos, right?
Okay.
Is that there's a truth there that we've decided we didn't want to know. So it goes into ignorance and arrogance. Ignorance is you don't want to know. Arrogance is you believe you know something better. So you no longer look for the truth. You just stay
Mhm.
with your own belief systems.
Mhm.
And part of what I see our greatest denial is that we're ignoring, we're in avoidance of the reality that we're experiencing. So denial is really like stripping away everything and seeing something in its raw, truthful version. And it's whether we like it or not, is own that is where the change has to occur. You cannot change a thing if you're in denial of reality. So and let
No.
no, you
No,
well, you can't
ma'am. No,
no, so
ma'am.
you can't change a thing. So we've got all these systems that aren't working in our favor. They're not serving us. We're serving it. Actually, we're being abused by most of them.
Mhm.
Right?
Mhm.
So, and we can't change that until we actually pull out the denial and go, what is it we are experiencing? And how did we get to here? And
Yes.
then all of a sudden you can see the map of how you got here. So that can sometimes give you a map of how to get out of here.
Yes.
But
Yes.
if we're in denial, then we're, the head in the sand scenario, nothing changes.
Right. And yes, and I write about this. I just touch on it, but the way, if we look at attachment theory and the way your clients are attached
Yeah.
to their relationship that they then come to grieve, how do we detach? I believe that our ability to detach or not
Mhm.
is proportionate. It's related to how we are attached. So if we are an anxious, avoidant attachment style, oh, it reasons you'll see anxious, avoidant attachment detachment, as the relationship is ending, and a frantic grabbing and fixing, and I love you, leave me alone, I can't live without you, get away from me, and whatever the relationship was like, if you have a healthy attachment style, great, then
Yeah.
you can have a, your base is going to be a healthy detachment style. But the denial is so important there, Lorraine. You're right, because if we're not able to examine this intimacy of ourself, if we don't really know ourselves well enough to understand our relationship, our reality, the map that got us here, it it's just, pitch your tent in quicksand.
Yeah, basically. And it's interesting because it's like, because I do courses on teach people how to be self-reflective, and really what you're teaching them is how to objectively observe. Like, and if you can do that, then you can move into those denials. And what always shocks us is how far we've been in denial. When you go, you have, an activating event. I do love
Hmm.
that statement.
Good. Yes. Uh-huh,
I'm
uh-huh.
adopting it.
Yes.
But you have an activating event, and all of a sudden you realize all you're breaking down your denial. See, I class evolution as a breakdown of denial, and truth comes forward.
Oh,
And
that's
you
brilliant.
start to value truth, but you've got to break down that denial. And we always go into shock at how much we've been in denial and how much we knew but didn't know we knew.
Oh, exactly, and there's grief in that, and it looks like,
Yes.
the Matryoshka dolls, the Russian nesting dolls.
Yes.
You say, "Okay, I'm gonna look at this," and you open it, and then you say, "Oh, okay, well," and then you open it again, and you realize why you
Yeah.
chose that relationship or why that friendship was so important at that time. We look at what else was happening in our lives that bring us to attach with these individuals who we're now grieving, and oh, there's just layer upon layer, just doll after doll of opportunity to
Yeah.
heal. And yes, it is painful, but oh, I go back to saying if we can get quiet and
Yeah.
tune, nourish and consume content like yours, feed your soul with healthy food and movement, nourish mind, body, spirit when you're grieving. Be careful about mindless scrolling, be careful about what you're watching. You don't need anything that's going to further activate your fragile nervous system. For
Mm.
me, I loved TED Talks. TED Talks helped me feel smart again after feeling for a while, how did I miss this for so
Yeah.
long? How I thought I was rather intuitive and aware, but how on earth did I miss this? Well, I it wasn't that I missed anything. It was that it was so well disguised.
Uh,
And right, but it is so important that we ask those questions and
mm.
nourish ourselves. Again, we know what we need. And if we're mindlessly scrolling on the social medias or just binging something reality TV, that's not helping us open those dolls and be reflective and
Yeah.
grieve.
And I see it a lot with narcissistic relationship breakdowns. It's like, be careful. You need to inform yourself. You need good information that informs you. But when it becomes an addiction, that you're feeding more and more of the same stuff, and especially if it's, a lot of the time what we're trying to do is understand. I call them the perpetrators. The perpetrator that caused the grief. If you're
Hmm.
trying to understand them constantly without really identifying and understanding yourself and putting yourself as the priority, then it becomes this quicksand that
Hmm.
drags you further and further in. And what you're doing is, once you understand it, if you're giving yourself more and more information, you're just reaffirming the hurt, reaffirming the hurt, reaffirming
Yes,
the hurt. There's a process that you do need to get information, especially in those kind of relationships, because you need to go, oh, that's what that's about. But once you get it, it's like, let yourself move forward in whatever
exactly.
direction. It might be a sidestep every now and then,
Absolutely, it's the
and that's fine.
cha-cha. It is, and,
Yeah,
we'll spiral. I say that hope is a double agent working both
yeah,
sides, and so,
yeah,
one day we're hoping that, oh, the friend is, it's my birthday, and the friend always remembers my birthday, and we feel hopeful the friend is going to send a card, and then the friend doesn't send a card, and then we are sad, but then we can hope for ourselves again, all within a 24-hour period. So,
yeah,
we're on this roundabout of hope, and that's normal to cycle in and out of it. It isn't just moving forward is a sidestep. It's not a linear process.
That's right. Yeah, and even if you feel like you're stepping backwards, you just you're going backwards to see something that you missed. That's all
Yes,
right. That's part of it.
exactly.
Bring it forward. Yeah,
That's right. Kick that rock over when you're back there, take a look, and then go keep on moving.
that's
Exactly.
brilliant advice. So thank you, Stephanie. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Likewise, Lorraine. Thank you for the important work you're doing. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to have been in conversation.